If you've heard me talk about the law of nations, and if you've read my pieces on the American Proposition website that talk about the law of nations, I mentioned someone by the name of John Epstein and the Mechelin group or the Malines group. These were a group of scholars who wrote about the natural law tradition and in the terms of international relations and the proper organizations of societies. If you want a really good synopsis of the natural law and the law of nations, you read Pope St John XXIII's Pacem In Terris. Pacem In Terris issued in April of 1963. So it issued in the wake of World War II, which ended about 17, 18 years earlier. And what you have to understand is World War II was a very horrible, bloody war marked by genocides, a lot of destruction, and it was waged and started by tyrants, by dictators, and it was fueled by nationalism and crazy ideologies. But it was also part of a struggle that had been going on in Europe, some say, since 1914 with the First World War and with the nationalism that the monarchs in Europe had encouraged and allowed disputes to fester as those monarchs fought for power. So what you have with Pacem In Terris is a statement of the law of nations. If you want a summary, read Pacem In Terris. And that provides a way by which the peoples of the world can get along and live peacefully. We're also going to look at Pacem In Terris through the eyes of Peter Riga, who was a Catholic priest, scholar, lawyer, and professor. He wrote a book called Peace on Earth, a commentary on Pope John's encyclical. It came out in 1964, but it was written in 63. It received the Nihil Obstat and Imprimatur from the Catholic Church at that time. So it's a highly acclaimed book, a very important book to help us understand Pacem in Terris. What we see in general, and there are going to be more general teaching points here. In general, what we see with Pacem In Terris is a way for the peoples of the world to live together. We see in peace and prosperity. We see in Pacem In Terris the four principles that I've talked about. The focus on the person, which is the four principles that are necessary for the right order of communities, of peoples, of states, of the international community. Four principles being the primacy of the person, the existence of a community of nations, the importance of the law or the rule of law, and finally, then peace as the object of our activity, of what we are doing here. So these things come out in Pacem In Terris, but also it comes out in Pacem In Terris that America is the model for the peoples of the world by which to live in peace and prosperity and pursue these four goals. And this is what Peter Riga talks about. This is what's contained in the encyclical of Pacem In Terris. So let's go ahead and start on in. Let's start with the foreword to Peter Riga's book, and it was by the Belgian Cardinal Swainens. And he says that the encyclical did four things, which I think is very accurate. One, an appeal for respect for the individual, the primacy of the person. Two, appeal for collaboration among nations. And right now, what you have are very powerful forces, the tyrants with neotrads wanting to break apart this collaboration among people, and they're working with nationalists and the transnational elites and tyrants like the Russians to do it. The third thing Swainens talked about was appeal for the creation of a supranational order, a world government, a world political authority, because that is a moral imperative under the natural law that Pope St John XXIII recognized, and the Church has always wanted that a world authority. Um, and then the fourth thing that Pacem In Terris does is appeal for collaboration among men despite their ideological differences. Okay. So this is really a very good synopsis. The encyclical is addressed to all men of good will, which is, quote, the first time in the history of papal encyclicals, and a quote, that has happened. It's addressed to the world, all men of goodwill. We're all in this together, which was the same theme that we saw in the social documents that came out of Vatican II. We're all in it together. Let's cooperate together for these issues that affect all of us. Cooperation is the one thing the tyrants and their lackeys don't want. They want conflict. That's why they're trying to discredit Vatican II. If they can discredit part of it, they discredit all of it, and they say, no, we don't want cooperation. It's not about that. It's about power. It's about our doctrine. It's about being right. Okay. They don't want cooperation. They don't want the natural law. They want conflict. That's what the tyrants want. Okay. So what Peter Riga says is, quote, John 23rd put an end with this encyclical, at least in theory, to the Catholic ghetto mentality, which has been prevalent since the Reformation. The concept of the church as an armed fortress fighting off the onslaught of the enemy is a thing of the past. Well, some people want to bring that back now. And that is a way you cause division in society, and you cause division in the world, and you give power to the tyrants. And the tyrants and the international, transnational elites, the tech bros, are trying to exploit this. They're trying to exploit differences. They're trying to encourage this way of thinking, this ghetto mentality, so that we go back, to fighting these wars. Because World War I and World War II were fought during the time of the Catholic ghetto mentality. Okay, John Tracy Ellis said the same thing in the 50s. And these scholars, these thinkers, realize there's a problem with Catholics. If we're going to really help the world, we need to get out of this mental ghetto, and we need to work with the world. And the way to do that is the natural law and the law of nations, which Pope St John XXIII talks about. So the Pope wrote about, he wrote about the necessity of Catholics to get involved in the modern world, and he said that the document Pacem In Terris harkens to, quote, concept of the law of nature, which is by no means an invention of the Catholic Church, as is sometimes erroneously believed, end of quote. Law of nature, the natural law, can be known by all men because it's written on our souls, it's written in our hearts. So it's something that appeals to men and it unites us to do God's will, and the natural law is part of God's order. Okay, so it's called the cooperation. Now, there's 6 parts in the encyclical. There's the introduction, parts 1 through 7, sections 1 through 7. There's part 1, which are order between men, paragraphs 8 through 45. Part 2, relations between individuals and the public authorities. Part 3, relations between states. Part 4, relationship of men and political communities with the world community, which is the call for a transnational entity in which Pope St. John XXIII approves the United Nations, which was created by the Americans, by us. And then part 5 is pastoral exhortations. So in the introduction, the Pope says the law of nature, the natural law, are, quote, inscribed in man's nature, and that's where we must look for them, end of quote. In paragraph, and then he goes on to say how a man must behave towards his fellows in society is the law of nature, or the natural law. In paragraph 157, he says, quote, the principles we have set out in this document take their rise from the very nature of things. They derive for the most part from the consideration of man's natural rights. Okay, end of quote. So the primacy of the person is part 1. Okay, primacy of the person, part 1 of the encyclical. And he said that the Pope writes, any well-regulated and productive association of men in society demands the acceptance of one fundamental principle, that each individual man is truly a person endowed with intelligence and free will, has rights and duties. Rights and duties are universal and inviolable, and therefore inalienable. And then he goes on, and then let's reference Mater et Magistra from section 219, which he wrote in 1961. He says, this teaching, and the teaching Mater et Magistra, rests on one basic principle, quote, individual human beings are the foundation, the cause, and the end of every social institution. That is necessarily so, for men are by nature social beings. This fact must be recognized, as also the fact that they are raised in the plan of providence to an order of reality which is above nature, end of quotes. The person is the foundation, the cause, and the end of every social institution. Not the family, not the ethnic group, not the state, the person. All of these things, to include culture and ethnic food and language, serve the person. Okay, that is the emphasis. There was this group years ago called Focus on the Family. They got it all wrong. It should be focus on the person, because the family is supposed to serve the person. Okay, so everything serves the person: culture, rights, duty, family, state, and so on and so forth. Okay, so then the Pope sets out a number of rights and duties. We're kind of losing time here. I'm not going to read them. They deal with a whole variety of different things. We'll go over them later. They're cultural, they're moral. their religious, their economic. But he also, too, it says man has the right to take an active part in public life, make his own contributions to the common welfare of fellow citizens. Uh, uh, Man, far from being an object or an inert element in society, is rather its subject, its basis, and its purpose. So he must be esteemed. Well, this is not the thinking of tyrants and dictators. This is not the thinking of nationalists. Okay? This is not the thinking of neotrads. They don't look at the person, they look at something else. So, with these rights come duties, not just to oneself, to develop oneself, but also the duties to protect the rights of others. Okay? The rights of others. And so, the Pope also says in part one, men are social by nature. They have to live together and consult each other's interests. In other words, they have to collaborate. Okay? And they have to provide abundant resources to do that. And it requires the involvement and collaboration of all men in the many enterprises which our present civilization makes possible. With the need to collaborate, the Pope says, there must be an attitude of responsibility. Okay? More specifically, the personal dignity, and in quotes, of a man includes that, quote, he enjoy freedom and be able to make up his own mind when he acts. Each man should act on his own initiative, conviction, and sense of responsibility, not under the constant pressure of external coercion or enticement, end of quote. Then he goes on to say there is nothing human about a society that is welded together by force. Far from encouraging, as it should, the attainment of man's progress and perfection is merely an obstacle to his freedom. End of quote. And that's paragraph 34. And there is a reference to Mater et Magistra that I made to myself of the importance of the human being to exercise initiative, because when the human being exercises initiative, then he cooperates in creation. Now, this idea of creation is co-opted by the likes of Kevin Roberts and the neo-fascists and the post-liberals and the neo-nationalists and the forces of tyranny today. They're co-opting this language of creation. But the reality is, as Pope St. John said, when you have initiative, and he said this in Mater et Magistra, paragraph 57, when you have people have initiative and they are involved with other human beings in society, then you get creativity and creation. That is very, very important. That is the reality of creation. Otherwise, you just simply controlled. Okay, so here's paragraph 57 of Mater et Magistra. Experience has shown that where personal initiative is lacking, political tyranny ensues. And in addition, economic stagnation is in the production of a wide range of consumer goods and of services of the material and spiritual order. Those, namely, which are in great measure dependent upon the exercise and stimulus of individual creative talent. And the key of this is personal initiative, which means freedom, which means an attitude of responsibility and understanding of the personal dignity of men, which includes that he, quote, enjoy freedom and be able to make up his own mind when he acts. Each man should act on his own initiative, conviction, and sense of responsibility, not under the constant pressure of external coercion or enticement. That's paragraph 34 of Pacem In Terris. Okay. Riga goes on and says that the United States, quote, the United States is a privileged nation. The primacy of the human person is in our laws and constitutions and is a great contribution to the world. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution which limits government, the Bill of Rights are ideals for the international political community. The fundamental principles of the American documents conform exactly to those of the United Nations Charter of UNESCO and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the basis of any human society, whether it be familial, national, or international, are the rights of the human person, which, when guaranteed and promoted by positive laws and constitutions, are called civil rights. Pages 58 through 60 of Riga's book. Okay, that's part one with Riga's analysis. Focus on the person, because that way you can develop, be creative, participate in creation. Our purpose is to help other human beings to live their rights, to fulfill their duties. And we have the rights and duties to ourselves and to other human beings. Domestic society, part two, is the common good. He sets forth the common good. Pope St. John sets it forth. And it consists of two aspects. It's quality and quantity. And he says that The concept of the common good exists for both the domestic societies as well as the international society. Because he recognizes, Pope St. John recognized that there is a domestic society of all these countries, all 193 or so countries, and then there's an international community. There's a society, international society. He says that in terms of quality and quantity of the common good, he says quality is the general welfare, is the essence of the common good. And he says, quote, the safeguard of the inviolable rights of the human person and to facilitate the performance of his duties is the principal duty of every public authority. It's paragraph 60. Quote, any government which refused to recognize human rights or acted in violation of them would only fail in its duty. Its decrees would be wholly lacking and in binding force. End of quote. Paragraph 60 and 61 of Pacem In Terris, where Pope St. John says basically the purpose of government is to ensure our rights, our freedoms, and our duties. That's what it does. But of those, our rights are the most important, as he says. The second aspect of the common good is the quantity. The civil authority not promotes justice for just one person or group, but it's all people in society. And the common good has to account for the various characteristics distinctive of each individual. The civil authority must strive to promote the common good in the interest of all without favoring any individual or citizen or category of citizen. And then related to this, paragraph 139 in a different part, there is a discussion of the common good, of the international common good. And so what Pope St. John talks about is he says the common good of individual states is something that cannot be determined without reference to the human person. Okay, read statement, paragraph 139. He says the common good of individual states is something that cannot be determined without reference to the human person, which America has always put as number one. And the same is true of the common good of all states taken together. Hence, the public authority of the world community must likewise have as a special aim the recognition, respect, safeguarding, and promotion of the rights of the human person. End of quote. So the international community has to mirror the domestic community, and that is the primary focus on the person. Focus on the person. All right. So then we get in to part three. Community of nations are several general ideas that all men are united. Men are to act from love and not fear. The natural law regulates relations. The moral law governs the country relations. Okay, that's very important. The moral law governs the relations, not the whims of each individual country. If you allow the whims of each individual country to govern relations, then you're talking about supremacy of the state, which has been rejected a long time ago. Okay, now this guy Mearsheimer, who I think is questionable credibility and questionable loyalty, has talked about the anarchic nature of the world society. It's not the Catholic view. That's not reality either. The moral, in his view of things, the moral law doesn't apply. It's just all about interest, personal interest. And so that's why Mearsheimer is really not a very good authority on much of anything. Because he does not understand how things are supposed to work and how things actually are. General imperatives to promote the common good are truth, justice, solidarity, and freedom, and from them come a number of rights. Now, talking about part three, Riga talks about the denial of state supremacy. He writes that power politics in which the weak are preyed upon by the strong is denounced. He says the Holy Father states that this is directly opposed to the moral law. There is an authority over the individual states. This authority exists because the universal common good, including universal peace, cannot be procured by any one state. The theory of state supremacy has been successfully challenged throughout the world, Riga writes, not only pragmatically, but also in various schools of law and political science. To discern this general disapproval of power politics, it is only necessary to recall, as Holy Father himself does, the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man, approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations. If, as the signs indicate, a universal juridical order is evolving, despite obstacles, which make progress slow and laborious, and I will add as a side note, the people who are most intransigent, most problematic, the ones who throw up the obstacles to this Catholic Christian human idea of this community of nations, of this strong United Nations, was the Russians. It was always the Russians, because they're not Christian. They attack everything that's good to try to destroy it, and that's why they're natural allies of tyrants who reject God's law and want to rule to their own benefit and destroy. So the Russians are inherently part of this problem. So, if, as the signs indicate, a universal juridical order is evolving despite obstacles, which makes progress slow and laborious, it is certainly owing to men's common longing for peace and their increasingly widespread belief that an enduring peace can be founded only on a law of reason, a law of justice and liberty, rooted firmly in the recognition of the rights of the human person. Rights of the human person. Okay? Again, the person. That is the essence of what we are talking about when we talk about the common good of the international community and proper relations between countries. Now, what what he talks about in this part three, which is sections 80 through 129, he talks about a number of rights and duties of states. They're rather long. I'm not going to go into them. I think I'm going to run out of time if I do, or it's going to be very long. And so he sets these forth between sections 80 and 129. And these sections deal with these rights that I have talked about and these duties that I have talked about and written about elsewhere, and that John Epstein wrote about, and that the Mechelin Group wrote about, and that are contained in writings and in the natural law. They deal with the rights and duties of the states to other states. These are the rules of the community of states, and they flow from four basic principles, which are truth, justice, solidarity, and freedom. Now, maybe we'll look at all this in greater detail at some other time, but you can find them in Pacem In Terris, which is on the Vatican website, paragraphs 80 through 145. Okay, so part four is the world community. And this is sections 130 through 145. And John the 23rd says that countries are interdependent. Quote, each country's social progress, order, security, and peace are necessarily linked with the social progress, order, security, and peace of every other country. No state can fittingly pursue its own interests in isolation from the rest, nor develop itself as it should. The prosperity and progress of any state is in part consequence and in part cause of the prosperity and progress of all other states. End of quote. He goes on to say that the moral order requires a public authority. Public authority as the means of promoting the common good in civil society is a postulate of the moral order, because you got a civil society in the world community, which America recognized from our beginning. Okay? But the moral order likewise requires that this authority be effective in attaining its end. The universal common good presents us with problems which are worldwide in their dimensions, problems which cannot be solved except by a public authority with power, organization, and means coextensive with problems and with a worldwide sphere of activity. The moral order itself demands the establishment of some such general form of public authority. This must occur by consent of all the nations and not be imposed by force. And it must cooperate with fairness, absolute impartiality, and dedication to the common good of all peoples. And that's paragraphs or sections 136 through 138. Additionally, the Pope wrote that the duty of universal authority is to create world conditions in which the public authorities of each nation, its citizens, and intermediate groups can carry out their tasks, fulfill their duties, and claim their rights with greater security. Subsidiarity still applies, and it cannot, quote, arrogate any of the functions of the individual states to itself. So in other words, the general public authority of the world, the world authority, cannot run each individual state. It can't take those powers. He wrote approvingly of the United Nations and the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and he said it's our earnest wish that the United Nations organization may be able to progressively adapt its structure and methods of operation to the magnitude and nobility of its tasks. That's paragraph 145. Now, you have a lot of neotrads and MAGAs in America First who attack the UN, who attack a world authority, who attack this idea of a community of states. They attack it, and they are devolution. They are rejecting the moral order when they do not support the UN Declaration of Human Rights, this idea of a community of states, community of nations, an international community, when they do not support this idea of a world governing political authority, which America put in motion, which Pope St John XXIII wrote about approvingly and told us we have to follow as part of the moral order in Pacem In Terris. When they don't do that, they're going against the teachings of the Catholic Church. They're going against the natural law. They're going against the aspirations of humanity. MAGA, America First, neotrads, all these people are devolution. And what they offer you is this navel-gazing nationalism, this shamanism. We really don't know what the rules are. It's whatever somebody says. We don't even know who they are. If it feels good, and they're gonna use pressure and fear, and they don't care about the person. And when you violate the person and his rights, then you're going to violate the common good of the domestic states of each individual state and the common good of the international community. Peter Riga wrote about Catholics. He was a great observer. This is 1963, 1964. Okay, so he's writing in 63, 64, and he's writing about Part 4 of Pacem In Terris. Now listen to what he says. He says, quote, in many respects, Part 4, which talks about a world, a global, a supranational authority. I know global has a bad connotation to it because of the power of the alt media, because of the power of dark narratives that were pushed by the Russians and fueled by transnational elites and tech bros and other wannabe tyrants. So it's got a bad connotation. But Peter Riga goes on and says, in many respects, Part 4 is the most momentous section of this encyclical. For the first time in papal history, a relatively complete statement on the moral obligation to form an effective world community has been embodied in the text of an encyclical. Now, the reality is that the church, through Epstein and a number of other organizations, the Malign Group, and I think the Catholic Association of International Peace, and a number of other alphabet soup organizations that I have in one of my articles, a lot of these groups, a lot of Catholics include Tapparelli, the Jesuit. We're talking about a world authority under the natural law, a global authority. Okay, this was the first time in Pacem In Terris, as Riga says, that this idea is embodied in the text of an encyclical, a relatively complete statement on the moral obligation to form an effective world community. I mean, if you're going to take, seriously, if you're going to take an encyclical and study it, Pacem In Terris is the one you take. That tells you how the world is supposed to work, societies are supposed to work, and we're supposed to get along with each other and work with each other. That is the one encyclical you take. So then he goes on, Riga goes on, this part of the letter will cause great consternation among Catholics who have consistently opposed any surrender of national sovereignty. The Holy Father argues that was always a truth, the solidarity of the human race, has now become a pragmatic reality. As a consequence, the moral order demands the formation of a world community which will promote the rights of man on a worldwide scale. World community, rights of man, worldwide scale, that's the common good. So he goes on to say the basis for the world community is the need to promote rights and dignity of the human person. This is Riga talking, as expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations and elsewhere. For many reasons, these rights can no longer effectively be promoted by individual states, but while technology has made the world a true community, this community existed before the advent of modern technology. The unity of the human family has always existed. There will always exist the objective need to promote in sufficient measure the universal common good that is the common good of the entire human family. Okay, these are not ideas that appeared in 1963. These are ideas that have been around for a long time. Okay, in Christianity, with philosophers who may be Christian, but their philosophy not necessarily Christian, with a lot of thinkers and jurists, a lot of smart people. These ideas have been around for a long time. Okay? And Riga, and especially Pope St John XXIII, is formalizing them and summarizing them in one document. Two conclusions follow from this observation, Riga says. First, the justification of a world political community does not depend on the consent of individual nations or relinquished sovereignty, but on the moral law, which demands that the common good of the whole human family be reconciled with and adjusted to the subordinate rights of the individual states. Since the common good in this age of advanced technology cannot be guaranteed by individual states, no matter how good their will, a superior political community must promote and guarantee the rights to the human family. From this comes the second conclusion. All men, and particularly all Catholics, have a serious obligation in conscience to aid, foster, and participate in this world community. All Catholics have a serious obligation in conscience to aid, foster, and participate in this world community. Well, that's not what you're hearing from a lot of neo-trads and nationalists and other bad actors. And that was section 137. Um, that was section 137 of Pacem. That is a reference to section 137 of Pacem In Terris, but that's from Riga's book. Um, okay, so obviously the isolationists are in opposition to the moral order. Obviously, they are setting themselves against the common good, the betterment of global society, world society, and domestic society. Obviously, they're setting themselves against the betterment of the person. Okay. Riga goes on. He says, as Thomas Merton puts it, quote, is there another choice today? The Western tradition of liberalism has always hoped to attain a more equitable world order by peaceful collaboration among nations. This is also the doctrine of the church. End of quote. This is Thomas Merton. Is there another choice today? The Western tradition of liberalism has always hoped to attain a more equitable world order by peaceful collaboration among nations. This is also the doctrine of the church. End of quote. Boom. Boom. That's what the tyrants, that's what the neotrads, that's what, the wannabe tyrants, the tech bros, the transnational elites, at least many of them, want to attack and destroy. That's why they have to attack America, which is based on liberalism, and also to federalism in its government, but liberalism. They want to attack America and they want to attack Vatican II. Because Vatican II talks about the natural law, talks about collaboration, cooperation, because liberalism is about cooperation and collaboration of different people. What's interesting in Pacem in Terris is that Pope St John XXIII references, sources going way back. I mean, he references Pius XII. Um, Part of that reference is the Summi Pontificatus, in which Pius XII condemned all types of racism and exaggerated nationalism, which is what you're getting now. You're getting exaggerated nationalism now from things like the UK Reform Party, the AFD, the Buchananites, the National Conservatives over here. You get into very thing condemned by Pius XII and the Catholic Church. All types of racism and exaggerated nationalism, as well as the legal positivism, which furnishes the defense of individual nations unwilling to diminish their sovereignty. You always hear about sovereignty, by the neotrads and others. We national sovereignty. What they're talking about is making the state the primary source of what's right and wrong, which is devolution, which has been condemned, by Riga, by Pope St John XXIII, by a number of other scholars and jurists that has been rejected. Um, okay, so that is part four. Part five is the pastoral aspect. It's the last 26, 27 chapters or sections of the encyclical. Basically, he says take part in public life, cooperate with others in goodwill, develop develop rules by which to work together on issues of importance to all. Issues of importance to all. And then change things gradually from within. Riga goes on and he talks about bringing peace. And he says it builds on something Pope St. John that says in paragraphs 1 through 4, paragraph 114 through 118 of Pacem In Terris. And in those paragraphs, Pope St. John mentions three motives for peace as the natural end of man. One, agreement that relations between states regulate with the principles of right reason, truth, justice, sincere cooperation. Two, a craving to be rid of the threat of war, see peace preserved. And three, proceedings that follow a rational, dignified course that begin with some point of agreement that is sincere, lasting, and beneficial. So what Pope St John does is says peace is the natural end. That's peace, the absence of conflict of wars, is a great thing, and the presence of justice and right order. Okay, is a great thing because it helps the person. It develops the person. It's oriented towards the person. Okay, when you have wars, the person suffers because his community is hurt, his family's hurt, he's hurt, and so a lot of other things happen. So, building on this idea, the motives for peace is the natural end of man, which is also one of the four things that I've told you America recognized from our beginning. Building on this, Peter Riga about talks about the importance of law. He writes on page 191 that universal peace is primarily a question of law. And this law, properly understood, must embody a concrete and operative structure, the inalienable rights possessed by every human being. These rights of an ethical and philosophical nature are incompatible with any form of government which denies the ascendancy of the human person over all external political authority. Without this foundation, this inner life, any attempts to erect a formal structure of society or of peace will be wasted effort. In mature society, justice is a means to an end, which is liberty. And liberty is that condition of civil life which is necessary to enable all members of society to cooperate in peace and prosperity to achieve their perfection, to attain their happiness, and thereby to fulfill in human dignity their divine destiny. Thus, the end of government and of law is adequately defined as a just and ordered liberty. The supreme test of any society or government national orientation will be the degree to which it protects and promotes these rights, thus establishing the human person, thus enabling the human person to achieve his destiny in liberty and dignity of a true son of God. Pacem In Terris lays out the law of nations, the natural law. Sets out the person as the primary objective of organization of all societies, domestic and international. It talks about the existence of a community of nations, an international community that has to be governed by certain rules, and that the rule of law is essential to making sure that peace, which is the object of our existence, which is the goal of our systems and and of all of our institutions, be achieved. And in that regard, there are certain rights and duties that must be protected, cared for under the common good. As you read Pacem In Terris and you read the commentary by Peter Riga, you come to the conclusion that America is the model for the peoples of the world, and that Pacem In Terris is the roadmap. Thank you.